in some ways it's hard to compete with the adrenaline rush you get when you see somebody dying or near death or threatened. I think that just gets our attention more vividly, and maybe it's a better setup for commercials too, I suppose. The trigger, the visceral response to hate and violence is an easy out for a journalist, an easy way to get attention. So this is maybe a harder form of journalism, because it asks people to engage in multiple aspects of being human. It asks them to think through the implications of the times we're in. So, for example, in Yes Magazine, we tend to start an issue theme with an article that could be quite discouraging. It says, we've got a problem here, folks. If it's on climate change, we might talk about just how dire that situation is, and we don't pull any punches on that. If it's about the prison system, we might talk about not only how many people are in prison, but what does it do to their lives and the lives of the people around them to have 2.3 million people behind bars. So we'd start with that, because we don't want to suggest that somehow there aren't these issues in the world, that somehow we're just going to make people feel good. The understanding of just how wrong things are also opens up the possibility for how things can be right, and shows the sort of remarkable creativity and even heroism of people at a local level who are taking on these issues, or at the national level. But we particularly focus on people at the local level because there's a level of human-to-human engagement there that makes things very real, that people can identify with, that require ground testing, if you will. Does it really work in a community? And if it does, then we think that gives it a veracity that makes it worth trying elsewhere. We do try to do some discernment about whether there seems to be a possibility embedded in a story. If it seems like it's going to be a dead end, even if it's, again, a sweet story, if it seems like it's not going to go anywhere, it doesn't have the possibility, we tend to not do the story. If it's a complex story that does seem to have potential, for example, worker-owned cooperatives, which have lots of complexity to them, then it seems like it's worth exploring. What can make this thrive? Where are the barriers and where are the potentials, and what are people's actual experiences? What is most real to the people there?
What's on their mind?
What's on their mind? What do they care passionately about? What makes them willing to stay up until the wee hours of the night reading 4,000-page environmental impact statements? That's today's heroism, right? Yeah, right. It's if you're willing to slog through that and then drive hundreds of miles to go talk to a bureaucrat who doesn't care, to try to get them to understand what this Otter Creek Valley is like now and why it should be saved. What is it? Where is their passion? That's what I'm trying to understand.
And then where does that story get told? That's real news.
That's real news, yeah. Yeah, and there's energy, and there's change, and there's creativity, and the possibility for something new to arise out of that kind of passion. If we start with the question of the suffering, for example, entrenched poverty in our cities, we would be looking for the question of what's possible now. And we'd be looking for the people who are developing answers and exploring what that means and what does it add up to. I am very allergic to anything that looks like it could be authoritarian or top-down. I've just seen too many people, even really well-meaning people, who take that top-down path and say, this is the solution for everybody. I think it's authentic heroism at the local level, but perhaps it isn't as satisfying as being able to make pronouncements for the entire country or entire civilization. And maybe the humility of doing that is, to me, both more authentic and less dangerous. One of the things I'm finding on this journey is how many people are looking at locally rooted worker-owned cooperatives as part of the answer. Well, that's interesting. So what does that add up to in terms of a different way of thinking about our workplace and our communities and the relationship of businesses to communities? And what does it mean to be locally rooted? Why does that matter? How does the wealth that's built in one small enterprise ripple out so that it can have long-term beneficial effects? So both are very practical, and I think journalism does very well at that, telling one particular story well. But then understanding the whole system implications, where can that take us? So that we can have a society where there's not just a really sweet project within a sea of devastation, but actually a sweet project that can, over time, shift the underpinnings of that devastation so that people can actually build a better kind of world. The left-right divide is far less salient at the local level. People are much more pragmatic, not ideological. An example of that is in this place in southeast Montana I was telling you about, where the coal mine is to go in. The people who are opposing it are the ranchers and the native people, the Northern Cheyenne people, and they're working together. And you know, I was at a ceremony that was taking place to welcome a totem pole that was carved by the Lummi tribe, which is where the coal would be, their reservation is where the coal would be shipped out to Asia on the Pacific Ocean. They carved a totem pole and brought it to the Northern Cheyenne people as a gift, as a way of saying, you know, this coal, which would be mined from your territory, would end up in our territory, and we're all in this together. So I was at the ceremony where this totem pole arrived in southeast Montana, and there were also all these ranchers there. And these ranchers their family had been ranching for generations. And some of them, when they got up to speak, talked about how much they loved George W. Bush. But not a lot, because mostly they weren't talking about national politics. They were talking about something that was happening right here. And they were using the same language. You know, the native people were talking about the land is sacred. We need to protect the water and the land. This was something that we inherited, and we have a responsibility to pass it along to future generations. Well, the ranchers were saying the same thing. They were saying, well, we haven't lived here as long as the native people, but we've been here for generations. We take care of the land. It is sacred. We have a responsibility to pass it along to future generations. So there is a way in which this connection to place, to the land, to the community, to family, to time scales, was the same for both the native people and the non-native ranchers. So there's a different kind of a dynamic going on at the local level that I think is much more real. I think one of the things that happens during any presidential election year is we allow the candidates and the political parties to set the agenda, and everything else gets pushed aside. So one of the things that we've done at Yes Magazine sometimes, and I hope to do again this year, is to say, you know, what do the American people actually want to see happen? How can we understand what our agenda is rather than letting it be set from the top down? And particularly, a lot of what's set from the top down isn't necessarily what people care the most about. It's what pushes buttons and also what gives people political points. So it may have very little to do with either what's most important to the American people, what big policy choices are coming, and what's really going to matter. So that's where I think an informed electorate is so important, is people not only being informed of the issues, but also being connected into independent kinds of political dialogues and political...
Alternative.
Yeah, so that people are actually saying to each other, well, what do you care about? Well, here's what I care about. And, oh, it's interesting, it doesn't seem to match what any of the candidates are talking about. Well, can we hold them accountable to what we care about, rather than us just rushing to support the one that seems the closest to our values or our sense of identity? I think it's way too much about politics. It's about people having a sense that this person is like me, rather than that, you know, these are the things, these are the ways forward for our country or our community. Where do we think we have the best chance of getting those things accomplished. I mean, local politics can be ugly too, so I don't want to, put too much of a gloss on it. But I think at a local level, people are far more willing to understand the complexity that is true of life and true of communities. So, for example, a business owner at a local level will understand that, yes, they need to make a profit in order to keep their business going, but they also care about the families of the people who work for them. And they also care about the drinking water, because they're going to be drinking the same water, so they're going to think about whether they're polluting that water, and they're going to think about the air quality, because they and their children are breathing that air. And they're going to think about politics, because a completely corrupt political system, while it might benefit their business in one way, can undermine their entire quality of life. So there are many ways, I think, in which an individual actor in a community, in a complex community, are able to see things from far more nuanced points of view. And when those people come together and hear from each other, and again, these are people that they're going to be living with over coming years, and their children are going to grow up with their children. So if you can bring those people together, I think you end up with a political process that reflects the depth and creativity and complexity of real life, and doesn't dumb it down into these very simplistic kind of hot button left, right, or me versus the other guy kind of dialogues. In terms of whether the time's about, I think they are times when we're really coming up against the limits. We're coming up against the limits in terms of the climate. People are feeling now that we can't continue as things are, that the weather is changing, that the drought conditions are making food problematic. The inequality is getting intolerable, the sense that before that there was some kind of a ladder out of poverty into the middle class. That belief is disintegrating, and people are feeling what is actually the case, which is that the divides are bigger and more resilient and more stable and growing all the time, so that the rich are getting richer and more powerful, and the poor are getting poorer and less powerful. So those things are happening, and they're happening in a way that I think there's growing awareness of, in spite of all the distractions that we see in the media that are trying to take our minds off of these really core issues that we're up against and distract us with a lot of other stuff, whether it's to make money or to get ratings. It's trivial in many cases. So those are the times that we're in, and I think people are far more sophisticated about that than they're given credit for. So I'm not claiming to sort of look for the objective overview. I'm looking for, is there a new story emerging out of communities? And if so, what is it? What are people trying to create? It may not even be a dominant story yet. It may be that the old story of big corporations and economic growth, and we can pretend that the climate isn't changing, and that the environment can be left to the side. That old story may still be the dominant story, but I'm seeing signs of a different story emerging as well. And that story is the one that I find the most hopeful. And I find the people who are engaged in that story just tremendously energized by it and encouraged and bringing other people along, because it's such a true story and such a compelling story.